Welcome to the conversations in intellectual history. Actually, it's advertised as history of science, but today we have a cultural and intellectual historian with us. Please, can you say welcome to Professor Peter Burke? I'd like to introduce Peter Burke to you. Peter Burke was a member of the School of European Studies at the University of Sussex before moving to University of Cambridge, where he holds the title of Professor Emeritus of Cultural History and Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Burke, as a historian, is not only a historian of the modern era, but one who emphasizes the relevance of social and cultural history to modern issues. He's married to a Brazilian historian, Maria Lucia Garcia Palares Burke, who worked with him in a couple of books as well, didn't she? Yes. He has various books, and he received, in 1998, he was awarded Erasmus Medal of the European Academy, but also you are a member of the Royal Historical Society or the British Academy?
Both, but the British Academy is a lot more important.
Important, yes. So his studies of the Renaissance include culture and society in Renaissance Italy, the Italian Renaissance, the European Renaissance, and his books also include exiles and expatriates in the history of knowledge, and the recently published Polymath in 2020, yes? Yeah. At the moment, he is currently working on the social history of ignorance. And he told me this morning that you actually finished writing the book.
Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, one can never finish a book like that, but at a certain point, I just decided to let it go.
Yes. So I prepared some questions for you, if you don't mind.
Please.
I'd like to ask them to you. Welcome to Istanbul.
Yeah, please, first. Yeah.
My first question will be about the ways in which you describe yourself professionally.
Yeah.
You are a cultural historian, among other things. What are those other things, Peter?
Yes, that's a big question, because I think I'm an extreme case of somebody with multiple identities. And so I certainly answer to the name of cultural historian. I'm more of an intellectual historian because I'm interested in objects, artifacts, and performances, and not only in texts and their meaning. But for a number of years, I did teach intellectual history, or the history of ideas, at Sussex, and I've never stopped being interested in it and writing articles in it, which is what led me to meet this most remarkable historian, one of the great historians of the end of the 20th century, Reinhard Koselleck, who called his particular approach, well, in English we'd say conceptual history, Begriffsgeschichte.
Yes.
And the idea of a network of interacting concepts, I think, is much more subtle than trying to write the history of what Lovejoy called a unit idea, and it's more organized than the Anglo-American tradition of intellectual history, which is a bit of an umbrella over all sorts of different activities.
Yes, yes.
So that's, but I haven't finished yet, because I also am happy to be called a social historian. And several of my books have got the word social history in the title. Social history of language, social history of knowledge. And that leads on to the fact that although in some ways I think plain historian is the best title of all, I don't want to be confined by it. I'm very interested in the social sciences. My kind of social history is very like historical sociology. And I've been fascinated by anthropology since I was a student, which means I'd like to say I'm a scholar working in the humanities and social sciences, writing history most of the time, but not always.
Okay.
So that's, I'm afraid, a rather long list, but as historians of identity know very well, it is possible to have multiple identities, and maybe even you make your primary identity a different one in different social situations. It's a bit like code switching in language.
Yes.
So in other words, yes to all those things, and I don't see them as incompatible.
Yes. And maybe the idea of specialization is, kind of labeling a historian or an academic in a particular way and sticking with it is actually kind of an old-fashioned idea. Would you agree with that?
It goes with the idea of specialization.
Exactly.
And having narrow fields with fences round, which some of my favorite historians passionately rejected. Rodel famously gave this tirade against walled gardens as a poet instead of an open landscape. And another historian I admire very much, R.B. Warburg, he talked about the intellectual frontier police and that you have to outwit them. So he was doing what other people called art history, but he called the history of images. And he refused to separate that from social history and other forms of history.
Yes.
So those two have been inspirations to me as well.
Yes. Actually, this question is actually about this. Yeah. The second question is about this. Obviously, you have a widespread influence all over the world with your works. Yeah. Actually, approximately 20 of your books were translated into Turkish, and they were published here. You have a widespread readership here. But what I would like to know is who influenced you and along this intellectual journey? And which works or scholars inspired you in your academic life?
Well, as you already remarked, I started as a historian of the Italian Renaissance. And that meant I was naturally going to be entangled with art history. And that meant, since I actually, as a student, as a third-year student, I took a special subject in the Italian Renaissance because it was the only special subject out of 10 or 15 at Oxford that included art.
Yes.
So that immediately meant I made contact with Jakob Burckhardt's work.
Oh, Burckhardt, yes.
And he remains one of my favorite historians and one of the historians from whom I believe I learn most. And when this book, Culture and Society in Renaissance Italy, was first published, it's a frightening thought, it's exactly 50 years ago, and it was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement, and the reviewer said, Burke is the Burckhardt of the 1970s, which I took as a compliment, although it's a double-edged compliment. But considering that the book is still in print 50 years later, maybe we could add a little extra to the 1970s now.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then already at Oxford as an undergraduate, I discovered the work of some of the Yanal people, which you're going to ask me more about that. Definitely, Rodel was a big influence. But then, as a student at Oxford, if you studied history, you studied nothing but history. It was one of these, you took 9 papers, all of them in history. And already I was feeling that was confining. And I didn't go to many lectures in history because I thought I can assimilate the knowledge faster from the books. But so instead I went to lectures on economics and social psychology, English literature, and like everybody else, art history, which was in a very curious situation at Oxford. They just appointed the first professor of art history, but there was no course, there were no students. And the first professor, Igor Wind, a refugee from Hamburg, where he was in the RB Warburg circle, so here things start to connect. He didn't mind not having students because what he loved was giving lectures, and instead of just a department, the whole university went. I mean, friends of mine, mathematicians, philosophers, chemists, they were there as well.
Were they public lectures or lectures within the university?
They were within the university. But then the number grew so great that there was no lecture room in the university which was big enough to hold the audience for Wind. So he moved to the Oxford Playhouse, which had nothing to do with the university, but it had enough seats.
Yes.
So he was an exponent of this Warburg tradition that art history is not just about style. You should say something about the content of paintings, what often called their iconography. Yeah. So there's that whole school, Panofsky, Gombrich, and so on. So I think that was very important for me when I started writing about the Renaissance, that I'd been exposed to something outside a history department.
Yes, yes.
And in sociology, there were no lectures because sociology hadn't been accepted by Oxford yet. But I did read people, and the two that stood out for me were Max Weber and, in second place, Karl Mannheim. And then I got interested in anthropology. So Evans Pritchard was the king of anthropology in Britain at this time. But then in France, there was Lévi-Strauss, who was already famous. And so I was reading these books and thinking, has this got any connection with history? Evans Pritchard was sure that every anthropologist should be a historian as well. Lévi-Strauss, I think, would have preferred mathematics. But anyway, they were both very interesting, and all these books stood out in my intellectual formation, I suppose you can call it, at Oxford and afterwards at Sussex.
Sussex, yeah.
Because going to an interdisciplinary university, it was like an education, a second education in itself.
This is Sussex, yes?
Yes. So after 5 years in Oxford, I took this job at Sussex.
Sussex, yeah.
And stayed 16 years, of which the first years were definitely me learning about a subject a week or two before the students. It's got its advantages and disadvantages. If you've just read the books that you ask them to read, there's a certain freshness about it. When I realized after giving the same sort of tutorials on the same subjects after 10 years that you can get a bit stale. On the other hand, I was probably rather superficial. I hope I got a bit deeper later, but after all, I did go on studying those subjects year by year. So those are the big names that stand out.
Okay. So I try to formulate this question. I have this quite adamant idea that whatever subject you specialize in,
yes,
one has to be aware of that specific subject's historiography. So I'm not just talking about historiography of history here.
Yes.
I'm actually talking about different disciplines. So would you agree with that, or is it not necessary?
I think I'll answer that in two parts.
Yes.
I think every historian should study historiography. It may seem obvious now, but there was no course for undergraduates in historiography when I studied history at Oxford. I was one of the graduate students who criticized this and said it would be a good idea to offer this, which actually very quickly, for its own reasons, the Faculty of History did after my time. Now, it's important in the way, if you value reflexivity. You know, Pierre Bourdieu told sociologists they had to be reflexive. They weren't outside the social world they were studying. They were inside it, and they ought to be aware of their place. like Michel de Certeau, who said historians need to answer the question, where are you speaking from? You know, to be aware that you made certain choices to write a certain kind of history about a certain subject. So that part I'm quite clear. Should everybody else be studying history? Interestingly, in the 19th century, if you went to university and studied medicine, history of medicine was part of the course.
Yes.
And if you studied some other subjects, philosophy was actually little more than the history of philosophy. But more and more, those bits of the course were eliminated because of the expansion of knowledge and trying to fit so much new knowledge about chemistry or whatever into the syllabus. Something had to go, and history didn't look as central, so it went. And it's a question of difficult choices. And I suppose I don't really dare answer for most disciplines, but I do think in the cases of sociology and anthropology, where I've got rather entangled myself, a knowledge of history is absolutely essential.
Necessary.
But then conversely, I think most historians would be better off if they had some knowledge of sociology and anthropology.
Yes, that's really important. So you talked about Annales School and Brodel being an influence to you. Would it be fair to consider you as a part of Annales School? And if yes, if the answer is yes, which generation of Annales would you identify with?
That looks like a simple question, but it's actually a bit complicated. In the 60s, when the Cold War was in progress, I used to call myself a fellow traveler of Annales, because everyone in those days knew that a fellow traveler was somebody who kept outside the Communist Party but sympathized with it and helped it. And I felt that's my relation. Annales is a kind of club. You don't, if you practice that kind of history, that doesn't mean you're in the group. You're in the group because you did your doctorate with somebody else in the group.
In the group, yes.
It's a network. I couldn't resist saying sometimes it's a family business, because there are several distinguished cases of father and son, historians actually of different parts of the world and different centuries, but still in the same style. There's, on the margin of Annales, there's even a group, I think, of 3 or 4 generations. There have been historians in every generation. So there was Maurice Crouzet, inspector of schools in history, and his son, François Crouzet, a very distinguished French economic historian, and his son, Denis Crouzet, who writes cultural history of the
running in the
religious
family
wars in France, and married another historian who works on Italy.
Yeah.
And their daughter, she's more of a global historian. It's rather incredible, not rebelling against at least the subject, the occupation of the parent, whatever they did for the rest of the time. So I'm an outsider looking in. I've made friends with a number of the group. I think that the greatest member of the group was Brodel, but I identify much more with the 3rd generation, because Brodel was a kind of super economic historian who widened out into what he called civilisation matérielle. In English, it's material culture, but was very hostile to history of ideas and mentalities. So then the 3rd generation then rebel against this, and Histoire des mentalités is important for them. Histoire de l'imagination sociale as well. And that meant they were working on what I call cultural history without calling it that. Finally, in the 1980s, Roger Chartier admitted that what he was doing was cultural history. I mean, he used the phrase histoire culturelle for a book of his essays. And since then, for the first time, I think, it's been normal to talk about histoire culturelle in France.
Yeah.
So, yes, definitely the third generation. And Daniel Roche, who's a little bit older than me, whom I know quite well. Chartier, who's just a few years younger than me. And now I suppose it's time to think whether there's a fourth generation. And there are two interesting people, one of whom I met, the other not. That Bernard Lepetit, very creative, was leading a return to the second generation, but not. And in history, you never have a simple return. Even if you try, you end up in a different place. So he was going back to economic and social history, but he would do it in a different way from the famous historians of the second generation. And the second one, who's closer to what I do, Patrick Boucherin, and he was a pupil of Georges Duby, so that puts him firmly in the group, and he succeeded Chartier in the chair of the Collège de France, which the Annales people more or less have controlled for a long time. But I admire his work, but never met him. But I would identify with what he's doing as well. Maybe the most original thing was to think of a book of essays by different people, which he called A History of Global France, meaning writing a history of France not firmly from within the frontiers, but looking at exchanges with other countries for the last 1,000 years. And it was inspired, obviously, by global history.
Yes, yes.
But it's done in a distinctive manner.
Yeah.
And several of my friends wrote chapters in that book.
Okay. Are you supportive of the idea of global history of science, which is actually happening at the moment? You know, the trends in global history, the, kind of decolonizing methodology.
Yes.
And in order to decolonize, historians are actually looking to globalize for wider connections.
Yes.
So do you appreciate this methodology?
As far as method is concerned, I'm a bit ambivalent. As far as subject matter is concerned, I'm very welcome the fact that many more students of history are now taking an interest, taking courses in what used to be called world history and is now called global history, though some global historians say that what we write is the history of globalization. So there's a narrow definition and a wider one. But in method, this is more complicated because the post-colonial approach is, of course, extremely controversial. At Sussex, one of my closest friends was a brilliant Bengali called Ranajit Guha. At that time, it was obvious he was brilliant, but he wasn't all that well known. And he loved talking, and I was afraid that he would talk his ideas and not write them down. But in fact, when he left Sussex and started alternating between Australia and India, he founded this group called Subaltern Studies, which has done very exciting work in Indian history. And it's partly inspired by Gramsci, partly inspired by Foucault, partly inspired by Edward Thompson. So a history of Indian nationalism from below and independence from below. Ranajit was very much in control of the concepts that he borrowed or stole from social science. I'm a bit more suspicious of some of the other people, or the post-colonial historians, for using, I think, sometimes uncritically, concepts that appeal to them from a range of subjects.
Yeah.
I'm all for borrowing or stealing from the neighbors, but you do have to adapt it to the problems that you're personally concerned with. You mustn't, therefore, be too reverent to the people that you're borrowing from, because what was right for them may be not quite right. It's like a tool that you've got to reshape for the particular task. So that means I know some of them, never got involved in a controversy with them, but I have this somewhat mixed
feelings
yeah.
about it, yes. This question that I would like to ask you is that you are interested in mentalities.
Yeah.
History of knowledge is one of your specialties.
Yes.
But you actually also study them in social context. How is it possible, Peter?
So this question takes us back to Karl Mannheim.
Yes.
So I was a graduate student. I was reading his work in what he liked to call the sociology of knowledge. At first, I thought this was a very strange concept. I remember thinking, if something's true, you don't need to explain it sociologically. Maybe, therefore, there shouldn't be a sociology of knowledge, but only a sociology of mistakes or misunderstanding or whatever. But I found him inspiring with this idea of the importance of the social situation. That is, everybody, and of course he was including the sociologists and not just the people he was studying, what they take for granted, what they believe is shaped, though not determined, by the social situation. Unlike Marxists, he didn't think that class was crucial, although he admitted it was important. He thought the generation was even more important. So that made him a heretic Marxist. I have to say that was part of the charm. And when I was reading Mannheim and realizing this was a man who non-Marxists believed was a Marxist, but none of the Marxists believed that he was. And I thought that was a great position to be in, on the edge, where you can see things that neither side can see. And indeed, that's quite close to another idea of Mannheim's, the free-floating intellectual, though I agree with his critics. You can never float entirely free. You can be more or less detached, but you still can't escape your situation. Reacting against it is a way of being shaped by it, just a more complicated way. And so when I moved from other kinds of cultural history to the cultural history of knowledge, I didn't call it the cultural history of knowledge because I thought knowledge is part of every culture, so you're not adding anything. But if you call it a social history of knowledge, that raises a flag. You're going to adopt a particular approach. It's not the only approach, but it's an approach that collectively we can't do without, because it's writing the history of knowledge and asking, well, who are the knowers? And do different kinds of people know different kinds of things? And how do they interact in a given society or culture? I mean, I believe that, if you like, classic history of philosophy and classic history of science, which focused on the ideas with not much attention to the environment, it's valuable but incomplete. And as somebody trained as a plain historian, I always think we historians are plain historians, art historians are colored historians. That was that this is the contribution we are in the best position to make, because the study of history is a collective enterprise. And so what writing a book from a particular angle doesn't mean you think that's the right angle and the other ones are wrong. Mm-hmm. You rejoice in the differences, but still you think that your own contribution would be better focused on this problem and not the other one.
Yeah.
As a result, I tried in the book to write about knowledges always in the plural. It doesn't work terribly well in English. I mean, I noticed when I gave lectures, people's eyebrows went up. Why is he saying knowledges and not knowledge? In French, there's absolutely no problem, savoir. It's perhaps because it's easier to pronounce, but anyway, the French do it all the time. Other countries up to a point. So that's like the red thread going through my different studies. I've actually written 7 books on different aspects of the social history of knowledge now. I suppose I decided about 30 years ago that I ought to settle down and work on one major topic. But then the idea would be always to try to find in each book a different perspective on that topic. That was why exiles in the history of knowledge. What's their place? Or stronger than that, what's their distinctive place in their contribution? And the polymath, it was a different take on the history of knowledge. And then I've often found in research that at a certain point, if you want to have new ideas, it might be good to turn the problem upside down, or inside out, if you prefer. And so when I was writing on the social history of language, I wrote an essay about the social history of silence. And some of my friends working on the history of memory discovered that forgetting was a good subject too. And so I decided I would write a social history of ignorance. Okay. This is quite interesting. My friends have generally reacted by saying, "Oh, how topical. I'm sure it's going to sell." So actually, when I started doing it, it didn't seem particularly topical. But then once Trump became president, it seemed like a triumph of ignorance, and that then I'm sure I shall sell more copies of this book.
That's right.
Thanks to Trump, to Bolsonaro in my wife's native country, and some other places that I won't mention.
Yeah. Yes. So you also wrote about art of conversation. Yeah. And would it be fair to say, because you're, among other things, you are an early modernist.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say early modern sociabilities put conversation in the center?
Oh, yeah.
And created an extra institutional sphere where alternative culture was created, which I think is one of the markers of the Enlightenment. What do you think? And if your answer is yes, I have another adjacent question. Are you a Habermasian?
Yes, that's a very interesting question that nobody has ever asked me. And of course, I did read Habermas among other sociologists. And and the book of his that impressed me most was indeed the one about the public sphere. Incidentally, like a good German, he used a much more abstract idea himself. He talked about Publicität, which is not commercial publicity, but it's the making things public. I think the concrete phrase public sphere that makes you think of real places like those coffee houses is a great improvement. Only I would finally suggest that public arena would be even better, because that brings in the debate where people express different and opposing views, which was crucial to this. That is, thinking not so much of the polite conversation of the salon, where you couldn't maybe go the whole way because he didn't want to offend people, to a more open conversation in the public coffee house and elsewhere. So I think that this is a great contribution, and I think it's inspired a lot of research. But when you inspire a lot of research, the conclusions of many of the researchers often undermine some of the things you say originally.
Yeah.
And like quite a number of other historians who have tried to work with Habermas, in my case, I was one of two authors of A Social History of the Media. And
yes.
so that pushed me very close to him at one point.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I share with these other historians two big criticisms of Habermas. One's geographical and one's chronological, and they go together. I mean, as a historian of the Italian Renaissance, it struck me that the public square in 15th century Florence and Venice was a great center of debate on politics, among other things. And then in Germany, where a friend of mine in Cambridge, Bob Scribner, was working on the Reformation from a social point of view, it was very clear that taverns were the place to be arguing matters of theology. Is Martin Luther right, or is the Pope right? And there are records of people being arrested because they'd supported Luther in a Catholic area and so on. So that gave sources. So that means that the public sphere didn't begin in London and Paris, and didn't begin in the 18th century, although this was a very important stage in its development. But that led me on, and I would have liked to talk to Habermas about this, but I never met him, that I think the concept needs to be modified, at least in the way that it's used. I don't think we should divide cultures into the ones that have a public sphere and the ones in which it's absent. I like to think in terms of having more of a public sphere or less of a public sphere in different places and periods. And even there are different public spheres that may not communicate with one another inside a given culture. A female public sphere as opposed to a male one, because I accept the idea that although for many centuries men have believed, or at least said, that when a number of women get together and talk, that's gossip, I accept the possibility that sometimes they're talking about politics or reforming society or whatever. They can do it at the well, they can do it in the marketplace, they can do it on the flat roofs of countries where the climate is hot. And that certain countries, let's take Russia in the 20th century, have moved to having more public sphere and then down to having less and so on. So, and all that is going beyond Habermas, but if Habermas had not published that book, I don't suppose we would be moving in these directions, so I remain grateful.
Yes. Okay, so you also wrote about cultural hybridity.
Yes.
In a world where cultural exchange is the norm, historically and otherwise, is it fair to talk about a purist notion of culture? Can you explain your views on this subject, Peter, please?
So I want to answer in a way symmetrical with what I was saying. That is, I don't think we should try to divide cultures into pure cultures and hybrid cultures. Every culture is partly hybrid. But I believe that the speed and amount of hybridization varies with the place and the period. And we happen to have been living through a certain acceleration in this respect, which of course then understandably and almost inevitably provokes a revolt against it. And so you have purifying movements.
That's right.
Which have themselves a long history. And when I was working on the social history of language, I became very interested in movements to purify language. The Greeks tried to get rid of the Turkish words. I believe the Turks tried to get rid of some of the Persian and Arabic words.
That's right.
Because you wanted a pure language for a new independent nation. Of course, it's impossible to do it completely. And some countries like France set up academies, the watchdogs of the purity of French. But they're swimming against the stream, and they can delay for 20 years the recognition of a word that the other people outside the academy have been happily using for ages. They can't stop the change.
No.
I'm pleased I live in a country which refused to have an academy of language because it allows people to speak in the way that they want. So I think, but then purification of religion, big controversial subject in Western Europe, obviously the Reformation.
That's right.
But obviously so important in Islam and sometimes in Hinduism and Buddhism as well. And then unfortunately, ethnic cleansing is a form of purification. So that means that people are prepared to sign up to a campaign to purify something. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean they'll achieve their goals, though they can, I think, cause a lot of harm on the way. So it's a complicated issue, and in a way, I almost wish I'd written the book about purity and hybridity together. But in fact, I was interested in the concept and its strengths and weaknesses. And so my original idea was to talk about cultural hybridity and cultural translation. But the publisher said, it's too cumbrous, doesn't work as a title. But inside the book, because some of hybridization is deliberate. People are interested in another culture and they want to copy it. I mean, this has been the history of so many countries, especially in the from the 18th century on. I became vividly aware of this when I started to visit Brazil regularly and talk to Brazilian historians, and the problem of imitation, that France and Italy, France and Britain became models for the Brazilian upper and middle class.
Yes.
But their imitation of foreign models, trying to dress like the British, which meant that middle-class men had to wear a dark woolen suit when the climate reached 38 degrees because that was what you did in London. Of course, it was also a way of showing that you didn't need to exert yourself. You have other people to do that for you. So maybe wearing uncomfortable clothes is a symbol of that as well. But anyway, this evoked a whole debate about imitation or what the Brazilians, who of course are extremely familiar with monkeys, called macacação, which means aping the foreigner.
Okay, yeah.
So some people believe that this is what should happen. Other people said this is wrong. It was just like Russia in the 19th century in the great debate. Westernizers on one side, Slavophiles on the other.
Yeah.
That was quite, it's a whole fascinating area, which leads on to the ideas of adaptation as the middle ground. And then it turns out that this idea of adaptation has a long history. In London, I went to a Jesuit school, so it was a matter of a certain pleasure to me to discover that the term accommodation was brought back into use in the 16th century by Jesuit missionaries who believed that they had to adapt the Christian message to Chinese beliefs, Japanese beliefs, and so on. The Pope didn't like this very much, but the Jesuits said, you're not going to convert people if you don't meet them halfway. So all that was conscious. And if it's conscious, I will call it cultural translation. But then a lot of hybridization takes place without anybody saying, I want to hybridize, I want to copy a foreign model. In the history of architecture, it interests me very much, and I did a lot of train travel in Europe. And you would notice a certain architectural style which was typically Italian. It started to be modified near the Austrian border. Now, I think it could be influenced at several removes. So you don't think of yourself as copying the style of the country next door. But because it was easy to cross the frontier, some of the artisans from Austria would work in Italy and the other way around. And as a result, you get a mix, but it's a mix that nobody had planned.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have a separate word for when you know you're doing it, and another one for when you do it without realizing.
What about cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation. What do you think about that term? You know, people are accusing each other about, culturally appropriating when you are adopting certain aspects of another culture. So that's the 21st century thing, isn't it? So what do you think about that?
And sometimes now appropriation has become the fashionable term, where when I was a student, people talked about borrowing, which is a much older idea. I think they are more or less the same. What's new, I think, and this is, I suppose, a result of increasing globalization, many people whose culture has been borrowed from resent it. There are places and people who hate the idea of translations from their language into foreign languages. They feel that the foreigners are stealing something.
Oh, their culture. Oh, okay.
So, whereas the enterprise of translation has often been justified, and I would go along with this, it enriches each culture because it makes works of literature in other cultures accessible and makes people more interested in other cultures. But one has to accept that some people resent this, and then them particularly likely to use the language of stealing and appropriation rather than the gentler one of borrowing. Yeah.
Yes. Your book, which was published in 2020, is called Polymath. Don't you think the idea of polymath is quite common in the early modern world? And that specialization and obsession with specialized expertise killed the concept. What do you think about that?
Well, one thing is I didn't want simply to present a portrait gallery of polymaths, although part of the interest of doing the research was making the acquaintance through their writings with a number of extremely remarkable people. And fascinating to try to guess how it was that they moved from one particular discipline to another discipline. But maybe this is again the social historian in me. I didn't just want to focus on individuals. And so the theme of the book is really the struggle between many-sidedness and specialization, which means especially from the 18th century onwards. nobody's written the history of specialization, curiously enough, though. I mean, people have contributed to bits of it. Just as far as I know, nobody had ever written a general history of polymaths, although, of course, I could rely on the scholarship of people who'd written excellent books about individuals and sometimes small groups. Just a second.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So I thought that the golden age of the polymath in Western Europe, because I mean, there's a Chinese story, especially, I think, ancient China, and there's a story in the Islamic world, what we Westerners ethnocentrically call the Middle Ages, is a wonderful time for Arabic-speaking and Persian-speaking polymaths. But I think in Western Europe, the golden age was the 17th century, when people collectively knew more than their predecessors in the Renaissance, and there were new disciplines coming into existence. But if you were extremely intelligent, had an extremely good memory, and were prepared to work very hard, you could still master many disciplines. But by the 18th century, this had all gone further, and people were specializing more and more. It began in medicine. It's very easy to specialize in medicine. You either work on a particular bit of the human body or a particular illness. And so from the 18th century, you've had specialists. Interesting too, I don't know whether that happens here. If you go to see a specialist as opposed to your general practitioner, he charges much more money.
Yes.
The GP, as we call them, they work equally hard, but they don't, not the same returns. No. But I like the idea of the general practitioner, and I tried to launch it as a way of suggesting that historians should have a lot of interests, rather than, and not just say, I'm an economic historian, but to be, especially when you teach, a GP in knowledge about the past.
Yes. Okay. My last question, if you don't mind. Your next book, which you finished writing, which will be published when?
They say January 2003 now.
2023, yes?
23, sorry.
Yes. Can you give a glimpse of your book? What was your central arguments? Were central arguments in the book?
As I said some minutes ago, I got into it because I thought that reversing the history of knowledge would be an interesting approach. And what I've done, I think, can be summed up in two quotations. The first one comes from the American humorist Mark Twain, and he said, "We are all ignorant just about different things." And that's something that is really central to my book.
Yeah.
It maybe has something to do with the fact that although I know more languages than most people, I've studied more disciplines more than most people, but I can't, when something goes wrong in the house, I have no knowledge of electricity, no knowledge of plumbing, I can't drive a car. So I respect people who know how to deal with all these things that I don't. So I think Mark Twain was right. But then the second quotation, which my wife gave me, and I suddenly realized this would be a good epigraph from the book. It comes from a presidential debate in Brazil in the 1990s. So the two candidates on television at this time, Fernando Henrique, who actually won, and an ex-minister of education called Leonel Brizola. And so they talked about education, and Fernando Henrique said, it's terribly expensive. We can't really have all these schools as you suggest. And Brizola made the immortal retort, I think, education isn't expensive. What's expensive is ignorance. And that that sums up the second half of my book, which is about the consequences of ignorance in different areas, in business, in politics, and in war. I'd never written about military history before, although I have to admit, when I was a schoolboy, military history was my hobby, and so it was actually my way into deciding that I wanted to be a historian. But by the time I'd got to Oxford, I was more attracted by artists than by warriors. And military history is especially interesting in the sense that ignorance is punished more visibly and more quickly in battle than anywhere else, more or less. And that includes not ignorance of what, the territory that you're fighting in, ignorance of what the enemy's doing. And it's particularly fatal if it's coupled with arrogance. And this has recurred again and again when professional soldiers face a non-professional enemy, an army of guerrillas.
I see.
They habitually underestimate them.
That's right.
They don't think about the other people defending their own country are much more highly motivated than the professional soldiers that have been ordered to invade it.
Right.
And then this is as true of Vietnam in the 60s as it is of the Ukraine now.
That's right.
And of course, that ignorance is relative, because even the winners make mistakes because there were things they didn't know. But the side that is less ignorant is the one that wins. Disaster management is another area, whether it's famines or floods or plagues,
That's right.
Pandemics. Usually the response being too little and too late because the people who had the power didn't have the knowledge. Very often there are other people in the same society who have the knowledge but not the power. I mean, once again, it's that age-old conflict between local knowledges and the centralized knowledges of governments.
Conflicting, yeah.
I was drawn into political history almost without thinking about it, but it has to play a role in the book.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a privilege to host you. And we organized this conference with the Center for the History of Civilizations, Center for the Study of Civilizations altogether. So we're very happy to host you here. Thank you very much, Peter.
Pleasure. Yeah, I'm sorry to put everybody to this trouble, but I don't hear as well as I used to. And I would like to answer the question that you asked rather than something that sounded a bit like it, which is dialogue of the deaf is.
Yes. I can ask the question, I mean, you can ask it to me. If you want to ask in Turkish, I will translate it for you. If you want to give a written questions, I can do that. Whatever you would like to do, I'll work for you, okay? Any questions? Hocam. Ekmelettin Hoca wants microphone.
Well, thank you for the wonderful afternoon and this great lecture. I have first to express that I'm happy and delighted to meet Professor Burke. And on behalf of the Turkish Society for History of Science, I welcome him.
I'll do that, Hocam. On behalf of the Turkish Society for the History of Science.
The history of what?
Science.
Oh.
History of Science. He's the president of the Society for the History. He wants to welcome you.
Right.
Ekmelettin Hoca, yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
My question relates to the discussion you raised about appropriation and of knowledge, and it came to me that Brudel, in his History of Civilization, he says the history of civilization is a history of borrowing. So what would be your comment on this?
Okay. So when we talked about history of appropriation, the concept of appropriation, Professor Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu says, Brodel, as far as he remembers, he talked about the whole history of civilization being a history of borrowing. Would you agree with that?
A lot of it, certainly, yes.
Yes. Hocam, any other comments? What do you think about? I mean, what Brodel says, but I don't think Brodel actually talks about kind of capitalizing on the culture. He talks about borrowing, but does he actually talk about, capitalizing on it? To borrow, yes.
Then, and this was more original of him in the 1940s, he said some cultures are defined by their refusal to borrow. And he talked about the way in which the Japanese resisted the chair, for example.
Yeah.
Maybe there was resistance to chairs here too, because that wasn't part of the everyday life. I think that was very interesting, that you have to bring this into the story.
Hocam, thank you. Any other questions? There's one there.
Hocam benim aksanım çok iyi. Çevirirseniz çok
Of
sevinirim.
course. Ama cümle cümle yapalım, olur mu?
Olur tabii ki.
Tamam.
Kültürel Melezlik kitabında Brezilyalılar üzerinde bir örnek veriyor. İşte diyor ki mesela futbol oynamalarıyla alakalı. Mesela diyor. Bir ismi vardı, onu unuttum da. Jogo Bonito gibi bir şey de olabilir. Hatırlamıyorum. Ve bunların kültürel olarak o kesimi, yani Brezilyalıları tanıttığını söylüyordu. Bugünlerde de işte aslında birçok kültür ürünü iç içe geçiyor. Ve aslında dijital platformlarla vesaire böyle bir farklı bir kültürel hibritlik söz konusu. Bu gidişi nereye doğru görüyor? Mesela artık bir salt bir şeyden bahsetmek mümkün hale gelmeyecek mi? Yoksa daha böyle farklı bir şeyler ilerleyen zamanda öne çıkacak mı? Çevirirseniz sevinirim.
Okay. In your cultural hybridity book, you talk about certain Brazilian cultures, as far as our friend here has read. But he would like to ask, as an example of hybridity, I think.
Yes.
But our friend here wants to ask about this kind of hybrid culture which is created by internet, social media, and such like. Would you consider this as a hybrid culture as well? Social media hybrid culture. Would you consider it as the new world of the internet? Would you consider it as hybrid culture?
The use of phrases like the culture of something have become extremely widespread. The culture of drugs, the culture of violence, and so on. As they multiply, I can't help asking myself, are these cultures or their subcultures? Now the word subculture has become unfashionable in English because people mistakenly thought it meant inferiority, but in fact it meant a culture which is part of a bigger culture. So that means that if you're into online culture or whatever we call it, that doesn't stop you being part of English or French or Turkish culture.
That's right.
So, and as sociologists point out, that there are many, many such subcultures in any big society. So, yes, in that limited sense, I have no objection. It's just at a certain point, it seemed there was a culture of absolutely anything. And I think some examples work better than others.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Yes?
So, sir, it has been an honor and a great opportunity for me to ask a question to you. I'm going to ask about this notorious term, popular culture. You know, since the 20th century, there has been a great debate on this definition of this term. And in your book, The Popular Culture in the Early Modern Europe, as far as I can infer, you describe this term as an intersectional field where church people, lay people, and aristocracy come together and have fun. So what's your point? What's your opinion on the demarcation regarding the differences between the popular culture and the folk culture? What are your opinions on this? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm afraid, although it was in English and I gathered it's about popular culture, but I missed the exact question.
Okay, so the question is, our friend here talks about the notorious concept, which
Yes.
is called popular culture.
Yes.
In your works, you talk about situation in the early modern world, which is created by several people from several walks of life, sharing and enjoying a certain particular culture. And would you call this popular culture, or what would you call it?
That's a difficult question. If you use the phrase popular culture, you have to be prepared to answer the social question. Well, who are the people? And it's interesting that this was has already a matter of debate at the end of the 18th century. And some people said, everybody's the people. And that was the time of the rise of nationalism in Europe, and sometimes writing about the culture of the Swedish folk was seen as a support of nationalism. But then the alternative was that popular culture is the culture of other people, and so you have an elite with one culture talking about the culture of the people they perceive as their social inferiors. And I thought, a very interesting change that took place in early modern Europe was that in the 16th century, the nobility participated in popular culture. But they had another culture, for the men at least, because that was the Latin culture that you studied at university. So there was this asymmetry. One group had two cultures, another group only had one. And then there was this withdrawal in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, where the nobility lose interest, and middle class even. And so that they look at the culture of ordinary people as foreign. And then in the Romantic movement, it's rediscovered as interesting because it's foreign, and middle class Germans tour the countryside collecting folk tales. But then, if you move into the 20th century, the story changes again, because with the rise of radio and television, a common culture was reestablished. Although not everybody in my universities admitted that they watched certain soap operas, but one knew that they actually did. But it made conversation with different kinds of people easier. You didn't just have to talk about the weather, because you knew there were certain programs which almost everybody was watching. And then with the rise of, with the digital revolution, it's fragmented again, and to an even greater degree. So that now, if you don't belong to the same subculture, you may have absolutely no idea what person you meet is talking about. It's a difficult situation, but from a historian's point of view, it's very interesting the way it's all gone. And I should add into the mix of concepts that in the 1930s to 50s in particular, historians and sociologists like to talk about mass culture. Now, I'm ambivalent about that. I never quite believed in the masses, but I do believe that there was mass production. So there were items of culture offered, mass-produced, offered to everybody. Maybe that would help turn people into masses, but then I think people can have the power of resistance and that they only appropriate a bit that suits them from these mass-produced programs and join them. And here I'm paraphrasing Michel de Certeau, who famously, talking about this issue, said consumption should be viewed as a form of production. You go into a supermarket, and it's the same as all the other supermarkets, but you make your individual choice. So, and even if you buy certain objects, but you put them together in a way that other people didn't put them together, and that means that there's your personal signature on them. So mass production is powerful. It does have effects on us, not just economic, but cultural. It can, to some degree, be resisted, I would say.
Any other questions?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for this. Was a great privilege for me, being able to listen to you here now. And my name is Ünal Gül. I'm a resigned naval officer. And this brings me to a question. What is your opinion on the world navies about the borrowed culture history? Did they accelerate this culture borrowing, or were there any effects on it? Thank you very much in advance.
Ünal Bey, soyadınızı alabilir miyim?
Gül.
Ünal Gül.
Yeah.
Ünal Gül is an ex-Navy officer.
Yeah.
So Ünal Gül wants to ask you about the role of the Navy throughout history in this whole cultural exchange. Have you ever dwelled on the idea of what naval trips and adventures actually created a world of cultural exchange?
It's easier for me to begin answering, at least, by talking about English history. So we had the wooden walls of England, which were the ships that would defend us, famously first against the Spanish Armada, where the weather was on our side, and secondly against Napoleon's attempt to invade. But then with technological change, by the time that Hitler wanted to invade Britain, the Air Force was playing the key role instead. But now, an important side effect was that for a long time Britain had no standing army, which was very good for liberties, because if you didn't have a standing army, it couldn't be used against your own population. And so, in that sense, I associate a navy with liberty. I don't believe this is always true. And what impressed me when I visited Chile was that two of the most powerful institutions in the country, the Catholic Church and the Navy, but they supported Pinochet. So I can't make a simple point that the Navy is always on the side of liberty. But these questions of the unanticipated consequences of having a powerful Navy or not having one, these are absolutely fascinating. Of course, if I wasn't British, but let's say came from India, then I would say something about empire building and so on. But there are all sorts of different ways of looking at this question.
Yeah. Any other question?
There's one over here.
Geliyor hocam.
Sesim geliyor mu?
Mikrofon çalışmıyor. Bir daha deneyin hocam.
Tamam. You know a book, a history of social history of science, written by Bernal, who is a British prominent historian of science. Also, you have a book, a social history of science. My curious is, what is differences or similarities between social history of science and social history of knowledge, in your opinion?
Yeah, I'll pass it on. There are books on social history of science as such.
Yes.
Science, and there is also social history of knowledge, which you are.
Yes.
So, what are the intersections?
Right, yes. I was thinking that the history of science would come up at one point. And I should say, as an outsider who never had a proper scientific education, I do have an amateur interest in the history of science, and I'm proud to say that my Cambridge College Emmanuel once had John Bernal, author of that famous social history of science. So I think there can be a social history of science just as there can be a more general social history of knowledge. Now, it's interesting. I explained how I came to the history of knowledge because I'd read Karl Mannheim, but I could have come by a very different direction because for the last 20 years or maybe longer, I am aware of a debate among historians of science about whether they should say that what they study is science or knowledge. And it's this problem about whether science is essentially the possession of the modern West from Galileo to now. And then there's the question, what does one say about the tradition of studying nature in other parts of the world and in other periods like the Middle Ages?
Yes.
One doesn't want to say they were just doing bad science. One doesn't want to say, though, that they were doing science in our sense. Wouldn't it be better, it would lead to fewer misunderstandings if people said, we're working on the history of knowledge, in our case, the knowledge of nature, but other people, the knowledge of society, and so on. So I know people that hold this position, and I know other historians of science who are still unhappy with this, and they want to preserve the traditional label. But so when I began writing about the history of knowledge, this happens so often in the history of scholarly endeavor. I began by thinking I was almost by myself. And then I quite quickly discovered that all sorts of people in different parts of the world had basically the same idea that one should be writing intellectual history at the level of history of knowledge and not just the history of ideas. In the United States, they don't talk so much about the history of knowledge. They talk much more about the history of information. As a cultural historian, I want to interpret this in terms of American culture, which is so pragmatic, I think, and therefore it's almost an anti-philosophical move that they're interested in collecting data and a bit more suspicious about what happens when you go to work on this in a philosophical way. But that's just an aside, and maybe and would amuse some of my friends and annoy others in the United States if they heard me say this. I did say it in Princeton once.
You did. Okay. There.
Sorumu Türkçe sormak istiyorum.
Evet.
2011'de Stephen Hawking artık felsefenin öldüğüyle ilgili spekülasyon sayılabilecek bir söz söylemişti. Ama biz hem Antik Yunan'a baktığımızda hem de Altın Arap Çağı'na baktığımızda bilim ve felsefenin hep yan yana yürüdüğünü görürüz. Acaba günümüzde felsefe gerçekten öldü mü yoksa bilimin yanında hala yürümeye devam ediyor mu? Teşekkür ederim.
Natural philosophy
Yes.
was the early modern concept, wasn't it, as a concept? And our friend over there asks, did the parts of natural separate from the philosophy in the modern age? Did the scientific undertaking and the philosophical undertaking are away from each other now? You know, do people still philosophize about scientific issues, basically?
Well, maybe it depends on where you're speaking from. In Cambridge, where there's an extremely lively group called Department of History and Philosophy of Science. So the people in it and the courses that they teach in Cambridge, they bring philosophy and science together, if you like, putting back together what was there in Newton's time and got separated later on. What I can't say is how far that is a common attitude in departments of history of science in other countries. It may be that there's a more serious split in other places, and that it's just good luck that the people I know most about are the ones who are extremely keen in bringing philosophy and history of science together.
I should be fair to the friend, because one other question that he asked was, do you think philosophy is dead?
Philosophy is just thought. I can't imagine that it could ever be dead in the sense of not being of interest to anyone. I suppose it's possible, though extremely unlikely, that philosophers would not think of any new things to do. But in fact, in an age of threats to the environment, philosophy of the environment is now flourishing. For example, there is a group of philosophers at Oxford are studying existential risks, which include artificial intelligence, but basically they are thinking in a philosophical way about the consequences of the changes taking place on the planet. So as long as we have these problems, as we're going to have for the foreseeable future, or maybe beyond the foreseeable future, it seems to me philosophy is very unlikely to die.
Any other? O zaman Peter Hoca'ya teşekkür edebilir miyiz arkadaşlar?
Okay.
Peter? Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.